The night began with a wind that felt wrong. It came in slow, hesitant gusts, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke long before any flames were visible. The moon hung high but dim, veiled by thin clouds that made the stars appear restless, as though they knew something dreadful was stirring. At the edge of the village, where the fields met the dark silhouette of the forest, Abony's small clay house stood quietly, the way it had for years, its walls holding the memory of every laugh, every song, every prayer whispered within. Inside, she sat cross-legged on a woven mat, grinding dried herbs with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to the silence of night. The faint glow from her oil lamp flickered with each draft that slipped through the gaps in the reed roof, but she barely noticed. Then a sudden crackle, sharp, intrusive, broke the night's stillness. It came again, louder this time, joined by the deep groan of wood straining against heat. Abony's head jerked up, her grinding stone still in her hands, her ears straining to confirm the sound. Outside the air shifted. The faint smell of smoke thickened in an instant, curling into her home and stinging her nostrils. She rose quickly, pushing the mat aside, and stepped to the doorway. The moment she lifted the reed curtain, her breath caught in her throat. The night sky glowed an unnatural red, as if the stars themselves had been drowned in fire. Flames leapt greedily along the roofline, their orange tongues licking at the palm leaves with a crackling hunger. Sparks burst into the air and swirled upward, joining a growing plume of black smoke that twisted and bent with the wind. Shadows moved in the firelight, human shapes, their faces obscured by the flickering chaos. Some stood still watching. Others murmured in low voices, their words carried away by the wind but their tone unmistakable. It was not fear in their voices but something darker, something satisfied. Abony stepped back instinctively, her chest tightening as the reality struck. The fire was not creeping toward her home, it had begun there. The flames had been set, and they were advancing with merciless speed. She could hear the dry palm leaves splitting under the heat, the timber beams moaning before they collapsed. The air filled with the acrid tang of burning clay, the smell of home reduced to smoke and dust. She turned quickly, grabbing the small woven basket where she kept her most precious herbs, but the fire had already breached the walls. A sudden gust sent a wave of heat washing over her, prickling her skin as if warning her to leave or be swallowed whole. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out the sounds for a moment, but then the world rushed back in, the roar of the fire, the gasps and mutters of unseen watchers, the pop of palm nuts exploding in the heat. She darted to the back of the house, only to find the flames had already curled around, blocking her escape. The clay walls that once kept her safe now held the heat inside, turning her home into a furnace. The smoke clawed at her throat, making her cough, her eyes burning with tears that were half from the sting and half from helpless rage. She had to move. Clutching her basket, she dropped to the ground and crawled toward a low section of the wall. Her fingers scraped against the rough clay as she pushed herself through, her thin frame barely squeezing out before the wall above her shuddered and collapsed inward. She tumbled into the open night air, gasping, the cool earth under her hands offering a cruel contrast to the blistering heat behind her. For a moment she stayed there, kneeling, her chest heaving as she sucked in lungfuls of smoky night air. When she looked up, she saw them clearly, figures standing just beyond the glow of the fire, their faces shadowed but their stances unmistakable. Some were villagers she knew well, people she had healed, people she had shared food with. Yet they stood there now, unmoving, eyes fixed on the inferno. A few exchanged glances, their lips curling in faint, satisfied smirks. The light of the flames danced in their eyes, making them look less like humans and more like something hollow, like shells filled with something cruel. Abony's mind raced. There had been whispers for months, murmurs of blame for things she had not done. A poor harvest, a sickness that took 2 children, a stillborn calf, events beyond anyone's control, yet somehow all traced back to her by tongues eager to taste scandal. She had ignored it, thinking the truth would be enough to shield her. But now, staring at the burning ruin of her home, she understood. This was no accident. This was the verdict of a trial she had never been allowed to speak in. The flames raged higher, consuming the last of her roof. Each crash of collapsing timber was like a drumbeat, marking the death of every memory stored within those walls. Her mother's cooking pots, the carved stool her father made before she was born, the bundle of letters from a friend in a faraway village, gone in moments, replaced by a shifting mountain of glowing ash. Above it all, the plume of smoke rose higher, twisting like a living thing, its dark tendrils reaching for the sky as if carrying her loss into the heavens. The villagers began to disperse, some slipping back into the shadows between huts, others vanishing down narrow paths without a word. But their retreat did not feel like shame, It felt like the closing of a door, sealing her on one side and the rest of them on the other. The fire's glow dimmed slightly as the roof collapsed entirely, but the heat still radiated, pressing against her skin, branding the night with its presence. Ebony stood slowly, her knees trembling but her spine straight. She did not shout after them, did not beg for answers. The night would give her none. Instead, she fixed her eyes on the last embers falling into the ash, and something within her shifted. Beneath the smoke, beneath the grief, there was a slow, deep pulse, like a drumbeat in her blood, whispering that this story was not over. The fire had been meant to erase her, but it had only lit a fuse the villagers could not yet see. And when it reached its end, they would learn that ashes do not always rest quietly. Before the night her world turned to ash, Ebony's life had been woven from the quiet threads of routine and solitude. Her home stood at the farthest edge of the village, where the open fields rolled into the whispering forest, and where the breeze carried scents of earth, flowers, and the faint musk of wild animals. She had always been a woman apart, not because she shunned others, but because her world seemed tuned to a different rhythm, one that most villagers could not hear. From dawn to dusk, she moved through her days with deliberate grace, each task a ritual. She gathered herbs at first light, plucking only those whose dew still clung to their leaves, whispering thanks before she cut them. By midday she would be drying roots on a flat stone warmed by the sun or grinding seeds into powder with the patient rhythm of someone who knew that haste could spoil a cure. Her hands were always stained with the colors of plants, green from crushed leaves, brown from damp earth, yellow from the dust of ground turmeric. Yet there was nothing careless about her appearance. She tied her hair back with strips of cloth dyed in indigo, and her clothes, though simple, were always clean and neatly mended. Her voice was soft, measured, and she had a way of looking at people that made them feel as though she could see something they themselves could not. It was this, more than her skill with herbs, that made the villagers uneasy. She had an uncanny ability to read omens in the wind, the way it shifted suddenly, carrying the smell of rain before the clouds arrived, or how it swirled in circles before an illness swept through the cattle. Ebony would often speak these observations aloud, never claiming them as prophecy, but people remembered. And when her words matched the events that followed, whispers would begin. To some, she was a blessing. Mothers came to her when their children's fevers refused to break, and hunters sought her salves to heal deep gashes from wild animals. She never asked for payment beyond a simple thank you, though people would leave her small gifts, a basket of ground maize, a clay jug of palm wine, a roll of dyed cloth. But for every person she helped, there was another who avoided her eyes in the market, or made the sign of protection when she passed. The first seeds of suspicion were planted years ago, when the wife of the chief lost a child in childbirth. Ebony had not been present, she had not even been asked to help, but it did not matter. The grief-stricken woman, desperate for someone to blame, claimed that Ebony had cursed her womb after a petty disagreement. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a mourning mother, but others listened. The idea took root, quiet but persistent, growing stronger in the shadows. Months later, a season of poor harvest gave the whispers new life. The rains had come late, and when they did, they came in torrents, washing away the seeds before they could take hold. The elders spoke of angered ancestors, but some villagers glanced toward the edge of the forest, where Ebony's small home stood untouched by floodwater. They noticed that her garden had thrived despite the weather, her cassava roots fat and unspoiled. She had done nothing to hide it, she had even shared her harvest with neighbors, but generosity did not soothe envy. If anything, it sharpened it. Then came the illness. It began with a boy from the next village, brought to Ebony by his desperate parents. She gave him a tea brewed from bitter leaves, but his sickness was already too far gone. He died that night, and by morning 2 more children had fallen ill. The sickness spread quickly, and though Ebony worked tirelessly, boiling herbs, burning certain woods to cleanse the air, many did not survive. Grief hardened into suspicion, and suspicion twisted into certainty for those already looking for a target. The illness, they said, had come with the boy, but it had been Ebony who carried it into the hearts of their homes. Her solitary habits fed the rumors. She was often seen at the forest's edge, speaking softly to no one visible, her hands moving as though weaving something in the air. She listened to the wind the way others listened to conversation, pausing to tilt her head, her brow furrowing as though it whispered secrets. Once, a group of children followed her into the trees and claimed they saw her talking to a great horned owl that did not fly away when she approached. The story spread quickly, and by the time it reached the ears of the elders, the owl had become a spirit, and Ebony its chosen vessel. There were still those who defended her, an old midwife who remembered the countless lives Ebony had saved, a few mothers who owed their children's health to her remedies, but their voices were quieter now, drowned out by the rising tide of distrust. When the chief's second wife, Nkiru, began to openly question why the village tolerated a woman touched by spirits, few dared to speak against her. Nkiru was clever, planting her accusations not in the open where they could be challenged, but in hushed conversations over shared meals, in the ears of those already uneasy. Ebony heard the whispers, of course. She saw the glances, felt the way conversations faltered when she drew near. But she had no proof, no way to defend herself against something as shapeless as rumor. She told herself that truth would stand against lies, that her work would speak louder than fear. Yet there were nights when she lay awake listening to the wind, feeling its unease ripple through the air like a warning. The day before the fire, she had walked through the market and noticed how people stepped aside just slightly more than usual, as if she carried something contagious. A group of women whispered behind their palms, their eyes darting toward her and then away. She ignored them, buying only what she needed, but the unease in her chest was heavy. The wind had been restless that day, shifting directions without reason, stirring the dust into small whirls that danced briefly before collapsing. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. She didn't yet know it, but the waiting was over. The decision had already been made. Somewhere in the quiet corners of the village, her fate had been sealed. Nkiru had always been a woman who measured her worth by the eyes that turned toward her, and in the early years of her marriage to the chief, those eyes had been plentiful. She was beautiful in a way that demanded notice, tall, with skin the color of polished bronze and a voice that could rise like a drumbeat or soften like the lull of a flute. She wore fine wrappers and gold bracelets that chimed when she moved, and she had learned the art of making her presence fill a space before she even spoke. But beauty and charm, she discovered, were fragile currencies. Over time, attention shifted. The chief's affairs grew more demanding, his gaze less lingering, and in the spaces where admiration had once bloomed, whispers about another woman began to root themselves. It was not a rival wife that drew those whispers, it was Ebony. Though she lived simply at the edge of the village, her name carried weight. Hunters spoke of how her salves saved them from infections that might have taken their limbs. Mothers whispered her remedies to each other like sacred knowledge. Even elders, cautious and proud, sought her counsel when the winds shifted in strange ways. Nkiru could not understand it. She saw no beauty in Ebony, no finery, no station. Yet somehow this woman's quiet presence reached places Nkiru's glittering charm could not. At first, the jealousy was a slow simmer, manifesting in small dismissals. Nkiru would scoff when Ebony's name was mentioned, claiming her so-called cures were nothing but luck or coincidence. But when the stillbirth happened, and when the harvest failed, and when the sickness swept through, Nkiru saw opportunity in the village's grief. She began to feed the unease, sprinkling her words like salt into open wounds. "She always survives when others suffer," she would remark in gatherings, her tone casual as though merely observing. "Her garden thrives while ours drown. Is that not strange?" She never accused outright, only asked questions, questions designed to lodge in the mind and fester. It didn't take long for others to answer those questions with suspicion. Two of the chief's distant cousins, both men who had once sought Ebony's help and been turned away when they refused to respect her rules, became her allies. A widow whose child had died during the illness joined them, her grief curdled into bitterness. They met in quiet places, in the shade of the chief's compound, at the edge of the fields at dusk, always looking over their shoulders, speaking low enough that even the night wind could not carry their words far. The plan was not born in a single conversation. It took shape like a shadow, piece by piece, as their resentment fed on itself. First came the agreement that Ebony was dangerous. Then came the belief that she was the source of the village's misfortunes. And finally the idea, spoken first by Nkiru in a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for a thought, that the village needed to be cleansed. "Fire purifies," she said one night, her bracelets catching the last light of the dying sun. "If we burn her house, we burn her power. The land will be free again." No one argued. In the quiet that followed, a pact was sealed, not with ceremony, but with the simple, terrible understanding that they would act. That night, the conspirators walked away separately, each carrying the shared weight of their decision like a hidden ember, waiting for the night it would be fanned into flame. They had chosen the night carefully, a moon half hidden by clouds, the village quiet except for the distant chirp of crickets. Nkiru stood with the others at the edge of the clearing near Ebony's home, her wrapper drawn tight around her shoulders more from anticipation than from cold. The fire had caught quickly, too quickly for their liking, as though the dry palm leaves and timber had been waiting for this moment. Flames leapt skyward, greedy and wild, painting their faces in flickers of orange and gold. One of the men laughed low in his throat. "By morning there will be nothing left but dust," he said, spitting into the dirt. Another smirked. "Dust and the memory of her curses?" he added, earning a few muted chuckles. Nkiru's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She kept them fixed on the blaze, drinking in the sight of the clay walls cracking, the roof bowing inward, each collapse like a drumbeat announcing victory. "She'll have no home to return to," the widow murmured, her voice tinged with satisfaction. "Let her wander. Let the spirit she loves so much keep her warm." They laughed again, but the sound felt oddly hollow in the open night. The fire roared, but beyond it, the world seemed strangely still. It was then that the first thread of unease slipped into the air. The wind shifted, not in a soft, meandering way but suddenly, like a breath drawn sharply between clenched teeth. It whipped around them, carrying the heat of the flames back into their faces, along with a dense, acrid smoke that stung their eyes and scratched at their throats. One of the men coughed, waving a hand as though to swat it away. "Wind's turning," he muttered, but no one replied. The smoke rose thicker than they had expected, clinging to the ground before curling upward in twisting shapes. In its swirls, the orange light of the flames seemed to dim for a moment as if swallowed. Nkiru blinked, her smile faltering. "It's just the dry season," she told herself, though she had seen many fires before and none had made the air feel this heavy, this watchful. The forest too was wrong. The usual chorus of insects had gone silent. Even the leaves seemed to have stilled, their rustle replaced by the crackle and snap of burning wood. The shadows at the tree line loomed, stretching long and strange as though they leaned closer to watch. Still, they stayed until the roof gave its final groan and fell inward with a shower of sparks. Only then did they turn away, their shapes melting into the darkness, carrying with them the satisfaction of what they believed to be justice, and the first unacknowledged prick of something colder than guilt. Something in the air had changed, and though they would not speak of it, each carried it home in their lungs like an invisible seed, waiting for its time to grow. Ebony had felt it before she had seen it, the shift in the wind, the tightening in her chest, the prickle along the back of her neck. By the time she stepped outside and saw the flicker of flames against the night sky, she understood what was happening. She did not scream. She did not run toward the house. She turned her back on it, walking quickly but without panic toward the cover of the forest. Every step was guided by instinct, the same instinct that had taught her which leaves could heal and which could kill. The fire behind her roared louder, the crackle of palm fronds snapping under the heat sounding almost like laughter. She didn't look back, not when she heard the roof collapse, not when she smelled the acrid smoke crawling after her through the trees. By the time she reached the deeper parts of the forest, the heat had faded but the smell clung stubbornly to her. She sank to the ground beneath a towering irako tree, pressing her palm into the cool soil. The wind here was different, heavy but steady, carrying no flame. She closed her eyes and whispered a single word into the earth, a name old and secret. Then she listened. Somewhere far away, the fire still devoured what she had built, but here the night was unbroken, patient. She stayed there until the light began to pale at the edges of the horizon. When the sun rose, the fire was nothing but a memory of orange embers and curling smoke. But what the villagers woke to was not the clean gray ash of an ordinary burn. The air itself was thick with it, so thick it seemed to have weight pressing against their chests. The ash hung low, refusing to scatter, drifting in slow, deliberate swirls as though it moved by its own will. It was not white or silver but a strange, sooty black threaded with faint glimmers of gold that caught the light and vanished again before the eye could follow them. It clung to the skin like oil, sticking in the creases of fingers, the corners of mouths. No matter how hard they brushed it off, it left a faint stain. The first coughs began before the morning meal. At first the villagers laughed them off, too much smoke in the air, they said. But by midday the coughing deepened, turning into ragged fits that bent people double. Eyes streamed with tears that burned instead of soothed. Children complained that their throats felt scratched raw. The smell was worse than smoke, rancid and bitter, as if something old and rotting had been stirred into the embers. As the day wore on, an unease began to creep over the village. No one could escape it, not by closing doors, not by hiding in the chief's compound, not even by walking far into the fields. The ash followed, slow but relentless, curling under eaves, seeping through woven mats hung over windows. When they breathed, it felt as though something was entering with the air, settling in the hollows of their chests. By the second night, fear had settled in as firmly as the ash itself. A young boy swore he had heard someone calling his name outside his family's hut, a voice he knew but could not place. When his mother opened the door, there was no one there, only a thick swirl of ash that slipped past her feet and into the room. An old woman claimed she had heard the voice of her husband, dead for years, whispering from the shadows, asking her to follow him. She had shut her eyes tight and prayed until morning. Even those who heard nothing began to feel watched. The ash seemed to shift in patterns too complex to be random, as though it were weaving shapes, breaking apart before anyone could be certain. A hunter returning from the forest swore he had seen faces in it, half-formed, eyes wide and mouths open, not in pain but in something colder, something that made him stumble and nearly drop his bow. The sickness spread slowly, not like a fever that strikes and burns through the body, but like a creeping vine wrapping around the lungs. People began waking in the night, gasping for breath, their throats coated with a bitter dryness that no water could ease. The chief's cousin, one of those who had stood with Nkiru, complained that the coughing kept him from sleeping. By the third day he could barely speak at all. The forest, usually alive with sound, seemed to hold itself apart from the village now. Birds did not fly overhead. The small animals that scavenged in the early morning stayed away. Even the wind moved differently, slower, heavier, pushing the ash not away but deeper into the heart of the settlement. The villagers began to whisper of curses, though no one dared speak Abony's name openly. Still, some glanced toward the edge of the forest, toward the place where her house had been, and then quickly looked away as though afraid the ash might hear their thoughts. By the week's end, the village was no longer laughing about the smoke. People walked with cloths tied over their mouths, their eyes darting constantly to the air around them. The coughing never stopped, day or night, and in the quiet moments between, the faintest of sounds could be heard in the drifting ash, like the soft murmur of voices too far to understand but close enough to feel in the bones. The air was no longer just heavy, it was waiting. The forest had always been Abony's refuge, a place where the air felt cleaner, the earth warmer, and the rhythm of life truer than anywhere else. But now, even beneath the towering Irako trees, the weight in her chest did not ease. She could still taste the smoke of her home on her tongue, bitter and clinging, as though the fire had burned something inside her as well. She had not slept since that night. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the flames leaping against the sky, and the faces in their glow. She sat cross-legged on a patch of moss near a small stream, staring at the water without really seeing it. Her fingers traced meaningless shapes in the dirt, but her mind was far from the forest. It wandered back to a different fire, one she had never seen but had heard of since she was a child. The fire that had taken her grandmother's village long before Abony was born. Her mother's voice rose in memory, steady and low, the way it always did when she spoke of dangerous things. "There is an ash that lives," she had said one rainy night, when thunder rattled their clay walls. It does not rise from any wood or leaf. It is the breath of the ash spirit, the dust of its hunger. Abony had been small then, her head tucked against her mother's lap, the scent of dried herbs and palm oil filling the air. It comes when injustice burns a home. It listens for the cries of the wronged. And when it hears them, it does not rest until the balance is made. At the time, Abony had thought it only a story meant to frighten children into kindness. But her mother had leaned closer, her eyes dark and unblinking. "If ever you find the air thick with ash that will not leave," she had whispered, "you must remember the words. They are not to be spoken lightly. They call not with sound but with the weight in your heart." Then she had recited them, old words in a language Abony never heard anywhere else. The chant had been like the rhythm of a drumbeat, rising and falling, almost a song but too heavy to be music. Now, sitting by the stream, the memory uncoiled in her mind like a snake disturbed in tall grass. She did not want to speak the words, yet they came to her all the same, one by one, until they filled the hollow in her chest. Her lips parted, and she let them fall into the air, not loud, not even enough to disturb the leaves, but enough that the forest seemed to tilt toward her. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was only remembering, not calling. But her grief pressed against the words, her anger pulsed between them, and together they seemed to sink into the earth beneath her knees. The stream's steady trickle slowed, as though listening. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of something older than fire, older than wood or clay. In the silence that followed, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The air around her grew warmer, though the sun was hidden behind clouds. Somewhere deep in the shadows a low sound began, not quite a voice, not quite a sigh, but something between the two. It came from no single place but from everywhere at once, slipping between the trees, curling under her skin. Abony's throat tightened. She had not meant to ask for anything. But the truth was that her heart had been screaming for justice since the moment she saw the first spark rise against the night sky. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, the shapes of her enemies formed, not with faces or names, but with the certainty of their guilt. When she opened them, the forest looked the same, yet different. The shadows seemed longer, their edges sharper. The leaves overhead shifted without wind. The stream's surface rippled though no stone had fallen. The feeling in her chest was no longer grief alone. It was a strange, steady heat, as though something unseen had heard her and marked her words. Far away in the village, the ash in the air thickened. It began on a morning that should have been ordinary. The market was alive with its usual clamor, women calling out the prices of yams, children darting between stalls, the smell of roasted maize drifting through the air. Udo, one of the strongest warriors in the village and a man who prided himself on never falling ill, was haggling loudly over a slab of dried meat when his voice broke into a sudden rasping cough. At first no one paid much attention. The cough of late had become a common sound in the village. But Udo's did not stop. It deepened, rattling through his chest until he bent double, his hands braced on his knees. The meat seller reached for him, but Udo staggered back, his face turning a frightening shade of red. His eyes bulged as if something unseen was tightening around his throat. The market quieted in a wave. People turned, craning their necks, their conversations faltering. The coughing grew harsher, tearing out of him in short, desperate bursts. Then he dropped to his knees, clawing at the air as though trying to push something away. A few swore they saw a faint swirl of black dust around his head, curling like smoke, but when they blinked it was gone. By the time two men reached him, Udo was on the ground, his chest heaving in shallow gasps. He tried to speak, but only a thin whistle escaped his lips. His eyes rolled toward the sky, then slid shut. The silence that followed was heavier than any before. The chief's voice broke it. "It is bad wind," he said loud enough for all to hear. "It carries sickness from the far fields. We must burn herbs and keep our homes shut tight." But the people did not look convinced. Bad wind was known in the village, yes, but it did not choose its victims. And it had never killed a man like Udo in the middle of the day under the open sky. A woman near the back of the crowd whispered, "He was there that night." Her neighbor shushed her, but the words had already taken root. Heads began to turn, eyes darting toward the others who had stood by the flames. They remembered the way Nkiru had laughed, the way Udo had fed the fire with his own hands. Before the sun had set, another man, one of those who had helped carry the jars of oil that night, fell to his knees outside his hut, gasping. His wife screamed for help, but no one came close. The sickness was no longer just a thing in the air, it was a curse with purpose, and everyone knew who it hunted. By the second day, 3 more were coughing until their voices failed them, all of them faces that had been lit by firelight when Abeni's home burned. Fear moved through the village faster than the sickness itself, thick and suffocating as the ash that still clung to every breath. By the week's end, the village no longer sounded like itself. The usual chorus of evening voices, laughter, arguments, the steady rhythm of pestle on mortar, had faded into a strained quiet. Doors were barred before sunset, mats pressed against cracks in the walls, and every window was covered in cloth. People moved through the streets with their faces wrapped in strips of cloth soaked in bitter-smelling herbs, speaking as little as possible, as if even words might carry the ash. The ash itself seemed to have a will. No matter how tightly homes were sealed, it crept in. Some swore they saw it curling under doors like a living thing. Others claimed it appeared suddenly in the corners of their rooms, gathering in small heaps that vanished when touched. And when the coughing began in a house, it was only a matter of time before the choking followed. What unsettled the village most was that it only seemed to seek out certain people. Those who had stood too close to the fire, those whose hands had fed it. The guilty swore their innocence, yet every day the same truth emerged. Another conspirator, gasping for breath, their eyes wide with terror. But the curse's precision had a cruel side effect. The innocent too began to turn on one another. Old arguments resurfaced like wounds that had never healed. A woman refused to lend her neighbor water, certain that his cough, though faint, was the beginning of the choking death. Men who once shared calabashes of palm wine now avoided each other in the fields, working in separate corners as if the earth itself might betray them. The marketplace thinned to only a handful of sellers, each setting their wares far apart. Even the children, usually too restless for fear, were kept indoors, peering from behind mats at the empty, ash-veiled streets. At night, when the wind shifted, carrying the faint, dry taste of ash, no one dared speak. The elders whispered that the ash spirit could follow voices through the dark, finding its way into the lungs of those it sought. Every morning brought news of another death, or at least another household sealed in silence. The chief tried to keep order, but his voice no longer carried the weight it once did. Too many had begun to wonder whether his hands, too, had been close to the flames. In the heart of the village, fear had become as thick as the ash itself, clinging to skin, seeping into breath, settling in the spaces between neighbors like a wall no one dared cross. The dawn light was pale and thin, barely breaking the hold of night when the first villagers saw her. A lone figure at the edge of the path, her steps slow but steady, the folds of her tattered dress dragging in the dust. The cloth was blackened as though pulled from the heart of a fire, its edges frayed and brittle. Her hair hung in tangled ropes, streaked with ash and dirt, framing a face that was gaunt but unbroken. It was Ebony. Word spread ahead of her like wind through dry grass. Doors cracked open, cautious eyes peering out. By the time she reached the first row of huts, half the village was watching from their thresholds. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed to have forgotten their morning calls. She did not greet them nor lift her hands in peace. Her gaze moved from face to face, pausing on those whose eyes darted away too quickly, the ones who had stood laughing in the glow of her burning home. For each she looked at, the air seemed to grow heavier, the taste of ash stronger. The coughs came fast, ragged and wet, bursting from throats already raw. Uduak, who had helped carry the jars of palm oil to feed the flames, doubled over before she had even passed him. His knees hit the ground, his breath whistling through lungs thick with dust. Ebony said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was heavier than any curse spoken aloud. The villagers began to murmur, their voices thin and trembling. Asterisk, the ash walks with her. Asterisk, asterisk, it clings to her shadow. Asterisk, some backed away into their huts, fumbling to shut their doors as though wood and matting could keep her gaze from finding them. Others stood frozen, caught between fear and the pull of something they could not name. Step by step, she moved deeper into the village, leaving no sound behind but the growing chorus of coughs and the soft hiss of her feet on the dirt. By the time she reached the market square, the air was so still it seemed the whole place was holding its breath. And still, Ebony said nothing. Her eyes spoke enough. The chief's compound stood at the highest point of the village, its wide courtyard shaded by an old irako tree whose roots coiled thick and deep into the earth. On most days, the compound was a place of bustle, messengers coming and going, women pounding yam in the open kitchen, the chief's voice carrying in loud proclamations. But that morning, as Ebony approached, it was silent except for the faint rustle of the irako leaves in the wind. She walked with the same steady, unhurried pace she had carried through the village, the eyes of the people following her from a cautious distance. The air seemed to grow heavier the closer she came to the compound gates. By the time she stepped into the courtyard, several villagers had gathered at the edge, unwilling to enter but unable to look away. The chief emerged from the shade of the veranda, his broad frame wrapped in a crimson robe. His face, once so confident, was drawn and lined with fatigue. Nkiru stood beside him, adorned in gold bangles, her chin lifted in a show of defiance that faltered the moment she met Ebony's eyes. Ebony said nothing. She did not bow, did not avert her gaze, did not acknowledge the chief's frown. From within the folds of her soot-stained wrapper, she drew her hand. In her palm lay a small heap of ash, dark and fine as ground charcoal. The wind seemed to pause, the leaves above her stilled. Slowly, deliberately, she let the ash fall from her hand, scattering it at their feet. It landed softly on the hard-packed earth, but the air shifted as though the ground itself had inhaled. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the chief coughed. Once, twice, deep, wrenching bursts that bent his body forward. Nkiru's hand flew to her mouth as her own breath caught, a sharp, wet sound tearing from her throat. The coughs grew harsher, faster, their voices breaking under the strain. They clawed at the air as if they could pull it into their lungs by force. The gathered villagers stood frozen. No one moved to help. They had seen this before but never so quickly, never so precisely. The ash swirled around the two like a living shroud, clinging to their skin, settling in their hair. Nkiru fell to her knees first, her gold bangles clinking weakly as her hands scraped against the dirt. The chief followed, his great frame trembling, sweat shining on his skin as his gasps turned to pitiful whimpers. Still, Ebony said nothing. She stood with her arms at her sides, her gaze unblinking. Her silence pressed down on the courtyard harder than the midday sun. The once powerful chief, whose voice had ruled the village, now begged between shallow breaths, his words tumbling out in broken fragments. Pleas for forgiveness, for mercy, for life. Nkiru's voice was hoarse, her eyes wide with panic as she clutched at her chest. but no plea could slow the tightening grip of the ash in their lungs. Around them, the villagers watched in terrified awe, the truth settling over them like a shadow. Power could not protect them, wealth could not bribe the air, and those who had fed the flames would one day be fed to the same fire. Ebony turned at last, leaving the two writhing in the dust. She did not look back. The sound of their coughing followed her out of the courtyard, carried on the wind like the echo of a warning. It began quietly, almost without notice. Those who had once stood in the shadows of the fire, laughing, whispering, carrying oil jars, now coughed in their homes, too weak to rise. The sound was the same each time, a dry rasp that deepened into a rattle, then into silence. One by one they slipped away, their skin taking on a pale, ashen hue that made them look like statues carved from dust. When the first body was carried out, the villagers kept their distance. By the third, no one would come near at all. Doors stayed shut, and only the bravest, or the most desperate, would peer through cracks in the mats to watch as the wind began its strange work. The ash did not linger this time. It lifted from the still forms in thin, spiraling threads, gathering in the air before drifting away, carried beyond the farthest fields, beyond the forest, beyond the reach of the village. By the end of the week all of them were gone. Every conspirator. The compound of the chief stood empty, its gates open and silent. The once lively market road felt wider, cleaner, as though some unseen weight had been swept away with the dust. No one spoke their names. No one dared. In the center of the village, Ebony stood alone. Her clothes were still the color of coal, her hair still tangled with soot, but the air around her was clear, no swirling motes, no faint taste of ash on the tongue. Children peeked from behind their mothers' legs to watch her, wide-eyed and silent. The elders did not approach, but neither did they turn away. The wind shifted, cool and light, carrying with it the sense of earth and cooking fires instead of smoke. For the first time since the night her home had burned, the sky above the village looked open and clean. Ebony's eyes scanned the horizon, following the invisible path the ash had taken. Whatever had been bound to her grief, her rage, was gone now, spent, carried far away. She did not smile, but her shoulders eased just enough for those watching to see. She had survived the fire. She had survived the ash. And the village, though it did not yet know it, had survived her reckoning. Years turned like the slow grinding of a millstone, wearing away the sharp edges of memory but never erasing its shape. The night of the fire became a story, the choking ash a shadow that clung to every retelling. Children, born long after the flames had died, grew up hearing of Ebony, not in the simple tones reserved for heroes or villains, but in that hushed mixture of awe and unease reserved for forces of nature. They called it the time of the ashes. Around evening fires, the elders would gather the young ones close and tell them of the healer who had once lived at the edge of the village, a woman whose hands could knit bones, whose herbs could chase fever from the body, and whose eyes, some swore, could see through lies. They spoke of the envy that had grown like a weed in certain hearts, how it had been watered with whispers and fed by fear, until it burst into flame one terrible night. But the fire, they would remind, had not been the end. No, the fire had been the beginning. For from the ashes had risen something older than memory, the spirit of air and dust that answered injustice with suffocating truth. The old one said it was not Ebony who cursed them, but the ash spirit that had been called by her grief, her rage, and the injustice she endured. The lesson was simple, they said, but sharp. Do not harm the hands that heal you, for the earth itself will rise to defend them. Her name was never banned, nor was it spoken carelessly. Some said it softly before brewing medicine, as if to ask for unseen blessing. Others avoided it altogether, not out of hatred, but for fear that speaking it too often might invite the spirit back. At the far edge of the village, the ruins of her old clay house still stood. The walls, though crumbled in places, bore the black scars of the fire, and the ground inside remained the color of midnight. No grass grew there. No wind stirred the ash. Even in the heat of the dry season it stayed cool, the air still and heavy. Children dared each other to touch the ground inside, but most stopped short at the doorway, claiming they felt a pressure in their chest, a warning they could not explain. The elders had made a decision long ago. The ruins would remain untouched. No one would rebuild there. No one would clear the soil. It was a place to be respected, a silent witness to what had happened and what might happen again if envy and fear were allowed to fester. The village rebuilt itself in the years that followed. New families settled, new homes rose, and the market once again filled with the hum of trade and the smell of cooking fires. But certain changes took root in the people's hearts. Healers, those who brewed herbs, set bones, or spoke to the spirits of the land, were treated with cautious reverence. Even when disagreements arose, no hand was raised against them, no home threatened. It was not simply fear that kept the peace, but a shared understanding that the balance between healer and village was fragile and precious. Travelers from other lands heard the story and carried it beyond the forests and fields, each version bending slightly to the teller's tongue. Some made Ebony a saint, touched by divine power. Others made her a witch who commanded the air to destroy her enemies. But here, in the village where the story began, they knew the truth lay somewhere between. Every so often, someone claimed to see her, an older woman now perhaps living far beyond the forest, her hair streaked with white, her hands still strong. No one could say for certain if she was real or just the shape of memory given form. But the mere possibility was enough to keep the story alive. And so, when the wind rattled the iroko leaves or carried the dry dust of the road into the air, the children would pause, some glancing toward the blackened ruins. They would remember the lesson as it had been taught to them. Fire may burn the house, but the ash will carry the truth, and the wind will never forget where it belongs.